The story of Moses is one of the most powerful and moving accounts in all of Scripture. It is the story of a man chosen from birth for a divine purpose. A man who would grow from the fragility of an infant hidden in a basket to a leader who would stand before Pharaoh, deliver an entire nation, and speak with God as a friend. His life is marked by triumphs and struggles, by obedience and hesitation, by failure and faith. Yet through it all, we see the hand of God shaping his journey. To hear his story is to be reminded that God works in the lives of ordinary people, turning weakness into strength and fear into courage. Moses' life carries 4 great identities: deliverer, lawgiver, doubter, and friend of God. Each identity reveals a different side of his walk with the Almighty. As deliverer, he was chosen to break the chains of slavery in Egypt. As lawgiver, he brought down the words of God carved in stone, words that would shape nations and guide hearts. As doubter, he revealed the very human struggles of fear and inadequacy that every person can relate to. And as friend of God, he reached the highest intimacy possible, walking in a closeness that few have ever known. His journey begins in Egypt, a land of grandeur and cruelty, where the Israelites had been reduced from honored guests to oppressed slaves. Their cries rose up to heaven as they labored under Pharaoh's harsh decrees. It was a time of despair, a time when deliverance seemed impossible. Yet in that very moment of suffering, God was preparing a savior. The birth of Moses, under the threat of death, was the first sign that the Lord had not forgotten his people. The story of Moses reminds us that God's purposes often unfold in the most unexpected ways. A child marked for death became a prince in the house of his enemy. A fugitive who fled in fear became the voice of deliverance. A hesitant shepherd became the lawgiver whose words still guide the world. His life is a testimony that no obstacle, no weakness, and no failure can stop the plans of God. As we walk through his story together, you will see how each chapter of Moses' life reflects the journey of faith that so many of us walk today. His doubts will mirror our own, his victories will encourage us, and his friendship with God will inspire us to draw closer to the one who calls us by name. The life of Moses is not only history, it is a living invitation to trust, obey, and walk with God, even when the road is uncertain. Before we begin this journey in full, I encourage you to take a moment to subscribe to this channel, like this video if you enjoy stories of faith, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps spread these messages to others who need hope and encouragement, and it allows us to keep bringing you more inspiring stories from the Word of God. The decree of Pharaoh was merciless, striking at the very heart of Israel's hope. Every Hebrew son born was to be cast into the Nile, a river that gave life to Egypt but now threatened death to God's people. Fear gripped the households of the Hebrews, mothers trembling at the thought of losing their children. Yet in this setting of cruelty and despair, an infant's cry carried a different destiny. Moses was born at a time when his life seemed destined for the river's depths. But hidden within that fragile child was the seed of deliverance that no earthly power could extinguish. His mother, Jochebed, looked at him and saw more than just a newborn. The scripture tells us she saw that he was a goodly child, meaning there was something marked upon him, a sense of divine favor resting on his tiny frame. For 3 months she hid him, shielding him from the soldiers who prowled with Pharaoh's command. The silence of a baby is hard to preserve, yet the hand of God kept him concealed until the day came when hiding was no longer possible. In an act of both desperation and faith, she placed him in a basket, coating it with tar and pitch so that it would float, and set it among the reeds by the river's edge. The river that Pharaoh had appointed for destruction became the place of divine preservation. What was meant for death became the channel of life. As the basket drifted, Pharaoh's daughter came down to the river to bathe. Her eyes fell upon the small vessel among the reeds, and her heart was moved with compassion when she saw the crying child within. She knew he was one of the Hebrew children, yet instead of casting him into the water, she chose to draw him out. The irony is profound. The very household that sought the extinction of the Hebrews became the shelter that preserved their deliverer. In the wisdom of God, even the tears of an infant can move the heart of royalty. Pharaoh's daughter, touched by compassion, decided to raise him as her own. Yet God, in his perfect plan, ensured that Moses would not be cut off from his heritage. Miriam, his sister, who had been watching from a distance, offered to find a nurse for the child. Pharaoh's daughter agreed, and so Jochebed, his own mother, was called to nurse and raise him until he was weaned. Imagine the joy in her heart, knowing that the child she had entrusted to the river was not only alive, but returned to her arms, safely sheltered under the protection of the royal court. Moses grew up in two worlds at once, nurtured in his earliest years by the faith of his Hebrew family, and then shaped by the education and privilege of the Egyptian palace. This dual identity was not accidental. God was preparing him to understand both the plight of his people and the power structures that oppressed them. He would one day stand before Pharaoh, not as an ignorant outsider, but as one who knew the language, the customs, and the strength of Egypt from within. The providence of God positioned him where no human strategy could have placed him. The story of Moses as a baby in the basket reminds us of the mysterious ways God preserves and prepares his chosen servants. What seemed like the end of his life before it began became the beginning of a destiny that would shape nations. His survival was not a stroke of luck, but the unfolding of divine intention. God was showing that no decree of man, no power of empire, and no scheme of evil could thwart his plan. The one whom Pharaoh tried to drown would rise to confront him, carrying the authority of the living God. The Nile had claimed countless lives under Pharaoh's command, but for Moses, the waters became a place of deliverance. This truth echoes through the pages of history. When God sets apart a life for his purpose, no weapon formed against it can succeed. Moses' journey from the basket to the palace is a testimony that even the smallest beginnings, marked by weakness and vulnerability, are sufficient for God to bring forth greatness. From that moment forward, the child who had been lifted from the river would walk a path that no one could have foreseen. His name, Moses, meaning drawn out, would not only recall his rescue from the Nile, but also point to the greater work of drawing out an entire people from the depths of slavery. What began with a basket among the reeds was the first step toward a destiny that would resound across generations. Moses grew under the roof of Pharaoh's palace, clothed in fine linen, surrounded by wealth, and educated in the wisdom of Egypt. He had access to knowledge, power, and privilege that few could imagine. Yet beneath the splendor of royalty, the memory of his true identity, planted in his heart during those early years with his mother, could not be erased. While the Egyptians saw him as their prince, he knew he was a Hebrew, part of a people enslaved and burdened under harsh labor. The palace halls echoed with laughter and feasts, but beyond its walls resounded the groans of his people. Moses could not ignore the dissonance between the comfort of his surroundings and the suffering he saw. The more he observed the plight of the Hebrews, the more the fire of justice stirred within him. His heart could not rest in the luxury of Egypt, while his brothers and sisters bled under the lash. That tension grew until it erupted one day when he came upon a scene that would change the course of his life. An Egyptian taskmaster was beating a Hebrew slave, striking him with cruelty and disdain. Moses watched the scene unfold, and his spirit was provoked. The sight of injustice pierced through the training of restraint he had received as a prince. Looking around and seeing no one to intervene, he acted. With his own hands he struck the Egyptian and killed him, hiding his body in the sand. What Moses did was not the act of a strategist, but of a man overwhelmed by a burning sense of injustice. In that moment, the stirrings of his calling as a deliverer came to the surface, yet it was expressed in human impulse rather than divine timing. Moses longed to see his people free, but his attempt to act in his own strength only led to fear and consequences he had not foreseen. The next day, when he saw two Hebrews fighting, he tried to intervene, urging them toward peace. Yet one of them retorted, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" The words struck Moses like a blow, revealing that his secret was not hidden and that his own people did not yet see him as their leader. Fear gripped him. If the Hebrews knew, then surely Pharaoh would know as well. Indeed, word reached the palace, and Pharaoh sought to kill Moses. The prince of Egypt, once secure in the courts of power, suddenly found himself an outlaw, fleeing into the desert to escape the wrath of the king he once called grandfather. The sands of Egypt, where he had buried the body of the taskmaster, became the very sands that marked the end of his life as a prince. This episode reveals the complexity of Moses' identity. He was both Hebrew and Egyptian, belonging to neither fully, torn between two worlds. His act of violence was not born from cruelty, but from the deep sense of calling within him to protect and deliver. Yet his timing was premature. He wanted to bring justice, but justice belongs to God. And the path of deliverance was not through impulsive action, but through divine appointment. Moses' failure was not the end of his story, but the beginning of a deeper shaping. His flight into the wilderness would strip him of royal privilege and train him in humility. What he could not achieve by force in Egypt, he would one day accomplish through obedience in the desert. His hands, that once struck in anger, would one day stretch in prayer, calling down miracles from heaven. His voice that faltered in defense would one day proclaim the words of God to Pharaoh. The prince who could not ignore injustice would become the prophet who would stand as the voice of divine justice. But before he could be used, he needed to be broken. The palace had given him education and confidence, but the wilderness would give him wisdom and dependence on God. The man who fled in fear was on his way to becoming the deliverer chosen by heaven. Moses fled Egypt with nothing but the clothes on his back and the fear pressing against his heart. The desert stretched before him, vast and silent, a place that seemed empty, yet was filled with the unseen work of God. Gone were the halls of Pharaoh, the comfort of riches, and the certainty of power. In their place came heat, dust, and solitude. The prince of Egypt had become a fugitive, stripped of position and direction, wandering through the wilderness of Midian. In Midian, Moses found shelter among shepherds. By an act of courage, he defended the daughters of Reuel, also known as Jethro, from hostile shepherds at a well. In gratitude, Jethro welcomed him into his household, and in time, Moses married Zipporah, one of Jethro's daughters. He settled into a new rhythm of life, tending flocks in the wilderness. What had once been the life of a prince became the humble life of a shepherd. For 40 years, this became his existence, far removed from the cries of his people in Egypt, far removed from the throne he once knew. At first glance, exile looked like a punishment, the ending of Moses' purpose. Yet in the wisdom of God, it was a preparation. The wilderness was shaping him, teaching him lessons no palace could provide. Day after day, guiding sheep through rugged terrain, Moses learned patience, attentiveness, and endurance. The desert stripped away his pride and gave him time to reflect on who he was and who he was meant to be. In the silence, the identity that had seemed divided, Hebrew or Egyptian, prince or outcast, began to be reshaped by a higher calling. The wilderness has always been a place where God prepares his servants. Away from the noise of Egypt, Moses was positioned to hear a different voice, one not of human authority, but of divine command. The long years of obscurity may have seemed wasted, but they were the training ground for leadership. Before he could lead people, he had to learn to lead sheep. Before he could face Pharaoh, he had to face the loneliness of exile. Before he could stand on holy ground, he had to be emptied of his own ambitions. One day, as he tended the flock near Mount Horeb, also called the Mountain of God, Moses came upon a sight unlike any he had ever seen. A bush burned with fire, yet it was not consumed. Flames leapt from its branches, but the wood remained whole, unscorched. Intrigued, Moses turned aside to see this great sight, and it was in that moment, when he turned aside from his ordinary path to pay attention, that God called out to him from the midst of the bush. "Moses, Moses," the voice spoke, and he replied, "Here I am." The ground on which he stood was declared holy, and he was commanded to remove his sandals. In that sacred moment, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob revealed himself, announcing that he had heard the cries of his people in Egypt and was sending Moses to deliver them. The wilderness that seemed like exile became the place of encounter, and the shepherd who thought his life was behind him discovered that his true calling was just beginning. The fire that burned without consuming mirrored what God was about to do in Moses' life. He would be set ablaze with a mission, yet not destroyed. He would carry the presence of God, yet remain a man shaped by weakness. The desert, once a place of hiding, became a sanctuary of revelation. Moses' encounter at the burning bush would mark the turning point of his existence, transforming him from a fugitive into a chosen vessel. Exile had prepared him for encounter. The silence had readied his ears to hear the voice of God. The humility of shepherding had softened his heart to receive a commission far greater than anything he could have achieved in Egypt. What seemed like wasted years were in fact the very soil in which destiny was planted. The voice of God spoke clearly from the burning bush, yet Moses' response was not immediate acceptance. Instead, it was hesitation. The mission laid before him was overwhelming: to return to Egypt, confront Pharaoh, and lead an entire nation out of slavery. Moses, once a prince, now a shepherd, felt unqualified for such a task. The weight of his past failures and the humility of his present obscurity pressed heavily upon him. He could not see himself as the instrument God had chosen. His first objection was simple: "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Years in the wilderness had stripped away the confidence of his youth, leaving behind doubt in his own worth. But God's answer shifted the focus: "I will be with you." The calling was not about Moses' ability, but about God's presence. Still, fear clung tightly to his heart. Moses raised another concern: what if they do not believe me or listen to me? To this, God gave him signs: the staff in his hand that turned into a serpent, his hand that became leprous and was healed again, and the promise of water from the Nile turning into blood. Each sign was a demonstration that the power Moses lacked would be supplied by God himself. Yet even with visible proofs, Moses' heart wavered. "I am slow of speech and tongue," he protested, confessing his weakness in communication. Some believe Moses may have had a stutter or difficulty speaking, but whatever the reason, he felt disqualified. God's response was firm: "Who gave man his mouth? Who makes him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." Still, Moses hesitated. His reluctance reached its peak when he pleaded, "Please send someone else." This struggle reveals the humanity of Moses in striking clarity. He was not a fearless hero eager to embrace his mission, but a man weighed down by insecurity, fear, and reluctance. His objections reflect the cries of many who feel unworthy when faced with God's calling. Yet in every response, God's patience shone through. He reassured, equipped, and even provided Aaron, Moses' brother, to be his spokesperson. God did not remove the calling, but adjusted the path to accommodate Moses' weakness, showing that his strength is made perfect in human frailty. What Moses failed to realize in that moment was that God's call is never about the sufficiency of the human vessel. It is about the sufficiency of God who fills that vessel. The fire that burned in the bush, without consuming it, was a living picture of what God was about to do with Moses. Ignite his life with divine purpose without letting his weaknesses consume him. In the end, Moses accepted the mission, not because his doubts were erased, but because he could no longer resist the God who had spoken so clearly. His journey would not be one of perfect confidence, but of trust built step by step as God revealed his power. The reluctant prophet, burdened with self-doubt, would become the leader who stood before Pharaoh, who lifted his staff over the sea, who received the commandments on Sinai, and who spoke with God as a friend. Moses' reluctance is a reminder that divine calling is rarely comfortable. It confronts fears, exposes inadequacies, and demands surrender. Yet it is also the place where God's presence becomes undeniable, his power undeniable, and his grace sufficient. The one who once said, "Send someone else," would one day stand as the voice of deliverance for millions. Moses returned to Egypt not as the prince who once walked its corridors, nor as the fugitive who fled in fear, but as a messenger of God, carrying a command that would shake the very foundation of Pharaoh's throne. Standing beside his brother Aaron, he approached the ruler of Egypt with words that were not his own. "Let my people go, that they may worship me in the wilderness." Pharaoh, the man who saw himself as divine, was suddenly confronted with a power greater than his own. Pharaoh's heart, however, was hard. To him, the God of the Hebrews was insignificant compared to the gods of Egypt, deities carved into stone and honored in rituals. The demand to release the Hebrew slaves sounded not only outrageous but insulting. Instead of granting freedom, he increased their burdens, commanding that straw would no longer be provided for making bricks. The people were forced to gather their own straw, yet the quota remained the same. What was meant to be deliverance seemed at first only to bring more suffering. The Israelites groaned, questioning Moses' mission, and Moses himself cried out to God in confusion. It was in this tension that the confrontation between God and Pharaoh escalated. Each plague that followed was not random, but deliberate, striking at the heart of Egypt's economy, religion, and pride. The Nile, worshipped as the source of life, turned into blood. Frogs, sacred in Egyptian symbolism, became a curse flooding their land. Gnats, flies, livestock disease, and boils followed, each one revealing the impotence of Egypt's gods before the Lord of Israel. As the plagues unfolded, the pattern of Pharaoh's heart became clear. At times, under the weight of suffering, he seemed willing to relent. But as soon as relief came, his resolve hardened again. This cycle of resistance revealed not just a stubborn king, but the deeper reality of a spiritual clash between the living God and the powers of darkness that held Egypt captive. For the Israelites, the plagues were both a terror and a revelation. They saw the God of their fathers moving in power, distinguishing between Egypt and his own people. Where Egypt was struck, Goshen was spared. Where judgment fell, Israel was protected. Through these signs, they were reminded that their cries had not been ignored and that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was still faithful. The confrontation between Moses and Pharaoh became a stage on which God displayed his sovereignty. Pharaoh's magicians tried at first to replicate the wonders, but soon even they admitted, "This is the finger of God." The pride of Egypt was humbled, and the illusion of control began to crumble. Yet Pharaoh, driven by pride and hardened in defiance, refused to yield. This clash of kingdoms was not merely about the liberation of slaves, but about the revelation of God's glory to the nations. Egypt, with all its power, wealth, and gods, stood against the creator of heaven and earth, and the outcome was inevitable. Through every plague, God was showing his people and the watching world that he alone was Lord. Moses, once reluctant and unsure, now stood firm in his calling. Each time he went before Pharaoh, his voice carried the weight of divine authority. He was no longer acting in his own strength, but as a vessel of the God who declared, "Let my people go." The confrontation between Pharaoh and Moses was, in truth, a confrontation between Pharaoh and the God of Israel, and it would reach its climax in the night of redemption. The plagues had devastated Egypt, yet Pharaoh's heart remained unyielding. Then came the final word from God, a judgment unlike any before it. Every firstborn son in Egypt would die, from the house of Pharaoh to the servant at the millstone, even the firstborn of the cattle. The weight of this pronouncement hung heavy over the land, but for Israel, this night would not be one of death, but of deliverance. God gave instructions that would mark a turning point in their history and identity. Each household was to take a lamb, perfect and without blemish, and sacrifice it at twilight. The blood of the lamb was to be placed on the doorframes of their houses. When the Lord passed through Egypt to strike down the firstborn, he would see the blood and pass over that home, sparing all who dwelt within. The meal that followed was to be eaten in haste, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, with cloaks tucked into belts and staffs in hand, ready for departure. This was not just a meal, but a preparation for freedom. As night fell, Egypt braced under the weight of impending judgment. In homes across the land, Israelites gathered in obedience, marking their doors with blood, trusting in the promise spoken through Moses. The lamb's blood became their shield, a visible sign of faith that separated life from death. At midnight, the silence was broken. A cry rose up from Egypt like no other, a wailing that echoed through the land. From the palace of Pharaoh to the lowliest hut, death visited every household that was not covered by the blood. The gods of Egypt, powerless to protect, stood silent before the judgment of the living God. In the homes of Israel, however, there was peace. The destroyer passed by, sparing those who had trusted in the blood of the Lamb. This was the night of redemption, the night when God's people were set apart, not by their strength or merit, but by obedience and faith in His word. Their deliverance was not earned, but given through the mercy of God who provided a way of escape. That very night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, his pride shattered, his will broken. "Go," he said, "leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested." After generations of bondage, the chains of slavery were broken. A nation once crushed under Pharaoh's hand now marched out under the covering of God's promise. The Passover became more than a moment in history. It became a lasting ordinance, a memorial of God's power and mercy. Every year, Israel would remember the night when death passed over their homes and freedom began. The blood on the doorposts was a sign of salvation that pointed forward to a greater redemption still to come. On that night, Israel was not only freed from Egypt, but also marked as a people belonging to God. They were no longer slaves defined by Pharaoh's oppression, but a covenant people defined by God's deliverance. The night of redemption was the beginning of a journey that would lead them through seas, deserts, and mountains, all under the guidance of the one who had spared them. The people of Israel left Egypt in haste, carrying unleavened bread and treasures given by their former oppressors. For the first time in generations, they walked not as slaves, but as a free people, guided by the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. Yet freedom was only the beginning. Behind them, Pharaoh's heart hardened once again, and he pursued with his army, chariots thundering across the desert sands. The cry of deliverance quickly turned into a cry of fear. As the Israelites camped by the sea, they looked back and saw the approaching army. Panic swept through the camp. Trapped between the waters and Pharaoh's forces, they accused Moses, saying it would have been better to die in Egypt than perish in the wilderness. The taste of freedom turned bitter in the face of looming death. Moses, however, stood firm, declaring words that would echo across generations. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. His confidence was not in himself, but in the God who had already shown his power in Egypt. Then came the command from God to stretch out his staff over the sea. As the night wore on, a strong east wind blew, and the waters parted. The sea became two walls, and a path of dry ground opened before the people. The impossible became reality. The waters that once threatened to drown them now became their escape. The Israelites stepped forward, walking through the sea as if through a valley between mountains of water. The sound of the wind, the roar of the waves held back, and the footsteps of a multitude filled the night. They walked not in the strength of their courage, but in the strength of God's provision. Each step was an act of faith, moving forward into the unknown, trusting that the waters would hold until they reached the other side. Behind them, Pharaoh's army pursued into the sea. Chariots rushed onto the same path, confident that their power would overtake the fleeing slaves. Yet the God who opened the waters now turned them into judgment. Wheels jammed, confusion spread among the soldiers, and as Moses stretched out his staff once more, the waters crashed back into place, engulfing the might of Egypt's army. When the morning light broke, the sea lay calm again, its waves washing over the lifeless bodies of Pharaoh's soldiers. The Israelites stood on the far shore, safe and free, their enemies defeated. A great cry of triumph rose from the people, and Moses and Miriam led them in song, declaring the greatness of the Lord who had thrown horse and rider into the sea. This moment became one of the most defining acts of God's deliverance in Israel's history. It revealed that God does not only bring his people out of bondage, but also destroys the power of their oppressors. The sea that had threatened their lives became the very place where their enemies were defeated. The crossing of the sea reminds us that God leads his people not around the impossible, but through it. Freedom does not mean the absence of challenges, but the presence of God who makes a way where none exists. For Israel, the path through the sea was more than an escape. It was a revelation of God's power, a call to trust him even when the way forward seemed closed. The song of triumph at the sea faded quickly as the reality of the wilderness set in. The people who had witnessed God's mighty hand soon found themselves grumbling against Moses. The desert was dry and water scarce. The journey that had begun with victory now became a test of faith. Thirst and hunger stirred discontent, and the cries of gratitude turned into murmurs of complaint. At Marah, the waters were bitter and the people grumbled. God showed Moses a piece of wood, which he threw into the water, and the waters became sweet. It was a sign that God could provide, even in barren places. Yet the people's hearts remained restless. In the desert of sin, their hunger drove them to accuse Moses of bringing them out only to die in the wilderness. Their words revealed not just physical need, but a lack of trust in the God who had already delivered them. In response, God provided manna, bread from heaven, that appeared with the dew each morning. It was unlike anything they had seen before, small white flakes that could be gathered and baked. Each household was to collect only enough for the day, except before the Sabbath, when they gathered double. Those who tried to store more than commanded found it spoiled with worms. The manna was not only provision, but also a lesson in daily dependence. Despite this miracle, complaints continued. When thirst returned, the people quarreled with Moses, demanding water. At Rephidim, God instructed Moses to strike a rock, and water flowed out abundantly. The desert, which seemed incapable of sustaining life, became a place of provision through God's power. Yet even with bread from heaven and water from the rock, the people's hearts were slow to trust. Their murmuring revealed the difficulty of transforming not just circumstances, but character. Freedom from Egypt was one thing, but freedom from the slavery of fear, doubt, and rebellion within was another. The wilderness exposed their hearts, showing that deliverance is not only about escaping chains, but also about learning to walk in faith. For Moses, the burden of leadership grew heavy. Time and again he interceded for a people quick to forget and quick to accuse. His patience was tested, yet his role as mediator between God and Israel deepened. Through his prayers and obedience, the people experienced God's mercy even when their hearts wavered. The wilderness became a classroom where both the people and their leader were tested. Each trial revealed something new about God's character, his patience, his provision, his holiness, and his desire for trust. The manna reminded them of his daily care. The water from the rock showed his ability to bring life from barrenness, and his responses to their murmurs revealed his enduring mercy. The journey of Israel in the wilderness was more than a physical trek. It was a spiritual shaping. The people were learning, though slowly, that the God who brought them out of Egypt was faithful to sustain them, not just with bread and water, but with his presence. The murmuring of their hearts was met with the steadfastness of God's grace, pointing them forward to the greater covenant that awaited at Sinai. After days of wandering through the desert, the Israelites came to the foot of Mount Sinai. It was here, in the shadow of that towering mountain, that God intended to shape them not just as a people freed from slavery, but as a nation bound to him in covenant. The journey had been marked by miracles and complaints, by victories and doubts, but Sinai would be the place where God's presence would descend in a way they had never seen before. The mountain trembled as smoke billowed upward like a furnace. Thunder rolled, lightning flashed, and a thick cloud descended. A trumpet blast sounded louder and louder, filling the people with awe and fear. The scene was terrifying, for the holiness of God cannot be approached casually. The people trembled at the sight, standing at a distance, while Moses was summoned to ascend the mountain to meet with God. God declared his covenant. If you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession among all nations. For all the earth is mine. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These words revealed that deliverance was never meant to end with freedom from Egypt, but with a relationship of obedience and holiness. God was not only rescuing slaves, he was forming a people to bear his name before the world. Moses ascended into the thick darkness where God was. There he received the 10 Commandments, laws written not by human hand, but carved into stone by the very finger of God. These commandments were not arbitrary rules, but expressions of God's character, teaching his people how to love him and how to live with one another in justice and integrity. They began with the call to worship God alone and to reject idols, reminding Israel that the God who delivered them was the only true God. The people, however, were struck with fear. They begged Moses to speak to God on their behalf, fearing that if they heard his voice directly, they would die. Their trembling revealed how far humanity stood from the holiness of God, and yet his covenant provided a way for them to draw near. It was both an invitation and a warning. He was their God, but he was also holy beyond measure. The giving of the law at Sinai was a defining moment. It revealed that freedom without order leads only to chaos, and that true liberty is found in living within God's design. The stone tablets represented permanence, the unchanging will of God inscribed for all generations. What began at Sinai shaped not only Israel's future, but the moral foundation of nations across the world. Moses stayed on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, enveloped in the presence of God. During that time, God gave him instructions for the tabernacle, the place where his presence would dwell among the people. Every detail mattered, from the Ark of the Covenant to the altar, each one pointing to the holiness of God and his desire to be near his people. Sinai was more than fire and thunder. It was the place where heaven touched earth, where a God of majesty chose to bind himself to a people through covenant. From trembling fear to stone-carved commands, the mountain revealed both the terror of God's holiness and the intimacy of his love. Israel was no longer just a group of freed slaves. They were now a nation called to live under the rule of the living God. While Moses remained on the mountain, the people below grew restless. Days turned into weeks, and with no sign of their leader, fear and impatience spread through the camp. They turned to Aaron, pressing him with their demands. "Make us gods who will go before us. As for this Moses who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Their hearts, still tethered to Egypt's idolatry, sought something tangible to worship. Aaron, swayed by their pressure, collected gold earrings from the people and fashioned them into the image of a calf. He presented it to them, and they proclaimed, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." A feast followed, filled with revelry, dancing, and sacrifice before the idol. In the moment of impatience, the people traded the glory of the living God for the image of a lifeless statue. On the mountain, God told Moses what was happening below. His anger burned, and he declared his intention to destroy the people and start anew with Moses. But Moses pleaded on their behalf, reminding God of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. His intercession reveals the heart of a true leader, standing in the gap for a rebellious people, pleading for mercy even when judgment was deserved. Descending the mountain with the stone tablets in his hands, Moses saw the idolatry with his own eyes. His anger flared, and he threw the tablets down, shattering them at the foot of the mountain. He burned the golden calf, ground it into powder, scattered it on the water, and forced the Israelites to drink it. The act was both symbolic and humiliating, showing them the emptiness of the idol they had worshipped. Judgment came swiftly. The Levites rallied to Moses' call, and 3,000 men fell by the sword. It was a sobering moment, a reminder that rebellion against God carries weighty consequences. Yet even in judgment, mercy lingered. Moses returned to God in prayer, pleading once again for forgiveness. "Please forgive their sin," he said, "but if not, blot me out of the book you have written." His willingness to be cut off for the sake of the people reflected the depth of his love and foreshadowed the greater mediator who would one day bear the sins of many. The golden calf episode revealed how quickly the human heart turns from faith to idolatry when patience runs out. The people who had seen the sea parted, who had tasted manna from heaven, who had heard God's voice at Sinai, turned away the moment their leader seemed absent. Their failure was a stark reminder that miracles alone do not sustain faith. Only a heart surrendered to God can remain steadfast. For Moses, the breaking of the tablets symbolized more than shattered stone. It symbolized a covenant broken by the sin of the people. Yet in the days that followed, God renewed his covenant, commanding Moses to carve out new tablets upon which he once again wrote his law. Judgment had come, but mercy was not withdrawn. God's presence would still go with his people, though the journey ahead would be marked by both warning and hope. The golden calf stood as a lasting warning in Israel's memory, a reminder of how easily hearts drift when trust falters. It taught them that faith is not sustained by sight or by idols fashioned from gold, but by clinging to the God who revealed himself in fire and cloud. In the aftermath of rebellion, Moses' relationship with God deepened in a way that set him apart from all others. Scripture records that the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks with his friend. This intimacy was not born of perfection, but of relentless pursuit, of intercession, and of a heart that longed to know God more than anything else. Moses set up a tent outside the camp, called the Tent of Meeting. Whenever he went there, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance, and the Lord would speak with him. The people watched from their tents, rising to worship as they saw the visible sign of God's presence resting upon their leader. What they feared to approach, Moses entered into freely, drawn not by duty alone, but by desire for communion. In one of the most profound conversations recorded, Moses pleaded, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here." For him, the promised land was meaningless without the presence of God. Victory, blessing, and inheritance meant little if they came without the assurance of God walking with his people. This prayer revealed the true heart of Moses. More than miracles, more than deliverance, he longed for the nearness of God. It was in this same exchange that Moses made a bold request, "Show me your glory." He did not ask for power or success, but for a deeper revelation of who God is, and God, in his mercy, agreed. He placed Moses in a cleft of the rock, covered him with his hand, and allowed him to see his goodness pass by. He proclaimed his name, declaring himself to be compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. This encounter changed everything. Moses' face shone with radiance after being in God's presence, so much so that he veiled it when speaking to the people. His intimacy with God was not only for himself, but became a testimony to the nation. The people saw the glow upon his face and knew he had been with the Lord. To be called a friend of God is the highest honor, greater than titles of prophet, leader, or lawgiver. It speaks of relationship, of trust, and of a mutual closeness that goes beyond duty. Moses, who once argued at the burning bush that he was unworthy, now walked in a friendship that transformed him from within. This level of intimacy was rare, even among the prophets. Others saw visions or dreams, but Moses spoke with God directly, with clarity. His life illustrates that friendship with God is not reserved for the flawless, but for the faithful, for those who seek him earnestly and walk humbly in his ways. The friendship between Moses and God shaped Israel's journey. His prayers often turned away wrath. His intercession bridged the gap between divine holiness and human weakness. The radiance of his face bore witness to the glory of God reflected in human vessels. And his bold request to see God's glory pointed to the truth that the greatest pursuit of life is not possession or power, but to know God himself. Years into the wilderness journey, the Israelites once again faced thirst. The pattern of murmuring returned as they quarreled with Moses and accused him of bringing them out only to die in the desert. Their complaints echoed the same doubts that had plagued them since Egypt, a reminder that their hearts remained hardened despite all they had witnessed. For Moses, the burden of leadership weighed heavily, and in this moment, his patience began to crack. God instructed him to speak to the rock before the eyes of the assembly, and water would flow out for the people to drink. It was a clear command, meant to demonstrate that God's provision came not through human effort, but through obedience and trust. Yet Moses, frustrated by the constant rebellion, gathered the people and spoke with anger. "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" With those words, he struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out abundantly, and the people drank their fill. The immediate need was met, but Moses' action carried a deeper consequence. By striking the rock instead of speaking to it, he had misrepresented God before the people. His anger overshadowed God's holiness, and his disobedience, though subtle, carried weight. God's judgment was firm. Moses would not lead the people into the promised land. The man who had delivered them from Egypt, who had stood on Sinai, who had spoken with God face to face, would not enter the land he had longed for. His moment of anger cost him the fulfillment of his earthly mission. This episode reveals the high standard placed upon those who lead in God's name. Moses' life had been marked by faithfulness, yet even a single act of disobedience bore lasting consequences. Leadership is not only about guiding people, but about representing the character of God accurately. In striking the rock, Moses allowed his frustration to distort the message of God's mercy. Yet even in this sobering judgment, God's love for Moses did not waver. He remained his servant, his prophet, and his friend. The consequence was real, but the relationship endured. This tension between discipline and love reflects the balance of God's dealings with his people, firm in justice, yet steadfast in mercy. For Moses, the striking of the rock was a reminder that even the greatest leaders are human, prone to weakness and failure. His story teaches that no one, however close to God, is beyond accountability. Yet it also teaches that failure does not erase God's love, nor does it nullify the eternal significance of a life lived in service. The waters flowed from the rock, sustaining the people despite Moses' mistake. God's provision was not withheld because of his servant's failure. His faithfulness to his people remained unbroken, showing that his purposes are greater than human error. The years of wandering drew to an end, and the people stood on the threshold of the Promised Land. For Moses, however, the journey was different. God had told him he would not cross the Jordan, yet before his life ended, God granted him a gift, a glimpse of the land from afar. From Mount Nebo, Moses looked out over the vast expanse, the land flowing with milk and honey, the inheritance promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. From that height, he could see Jericho, the valleys, the hills, and the fertile plains. Though his feet would never touch its soil, his eyes beheld the fulfillment of everything he had labored for. It was a bittersweet moment. Joy in seeing God's promise, sorrow in knowing he would not enter. Yet even in this, Moses submitted to the will of God, content to know that the people he had led through so much would walk into the promise without him. His farewell was not marked by bitterness, but by blessing. Before climbing the mountain, Moses spoke to the tribes of Israel, blessing each one and reminding them of God's faithfulness. His words were not of regret, but of encouragement, urging them to cling to the covenant and to trust the God who had brought them thus far. His final act as leader was to point them forward, not to himself, but to the one who would continue to guide them. On Mount Nebo, Moses breathed his last. Scripture says that God himself buried him in a valley in Moab, and no one knows the place of his burial to this day. The image of God personally laying his servant to rest is one of the most tender moments in all of Scripture. The man who had stood before Pharaoh, who had ascended Sinai, who had led a nation, was laid to rest by the hands of the one he had served. Moses' life was not defined by entering the land, but by his faithfulness to the journey. His legacy was not measured by reaching the destination, but by leading the people toward it. He was a deliverer, a lawgiver, a mediator, and a friend of God. His story ended on a mountain overlooking the promise, yet his impact extended far beyond his own lifetime. The farewell of Moses reminds us that God's servants do not always see the fullness of the promises they labor toward, yet their faithfulness lays the foundation for others to enter in. Moses did not cross the Jordan, but his leadership prepared Joshua to lead the people forward. His life became a bridge between bondage and promise, between despair and hope. Moses' death was not the end of his influence. His words, his law, his prayers, and his example continued to shape Israel for generations. Even centuries later, his name was spoken with reverence, and his story remembered as a testimony of what it means to walk with God. On Mount Nebo, with the land stretched before him and the hand of God resting upon him, Moses' journey came full circle. From the basket on the Nile to the mountain of farewell, his life was a tapestry of deliverance, covenant, failure, and friendship. He did not enter the land, but he entered into the presence of the God he had known face to face. The story of Moses does not end on Mount Nebo, for his life echoes through generations. His journey from a fragile child in a basket to a leader who spoke with God face to face is more than history. It is a mirror reflecting the spiritual journey of every soul who seeks to walk with the divine. His courage, his doubts, his obedience, and even his failures speak into the struggles of humanity with timeless relevance. In Moses, we see the truth that God calls the unlikely. He was a man with a hesitant tongue, yet chosen to speak before kings. He was a fugitive, yet called to lead a nation. His weaknesses were many, but they became the very places where God's strength was revealed. The echo of his life reminds us that our limitations do not disqualify us from God's purposes. Rather, they become the stage on which his power is displayed. The deliverance of Israel from Egypt speaks to every heart bound by fear, doubt, or oppression. Just as Moses stretched out his staff over the sea, we too are invited to trust the God who makes a way when none appears. The wilderness, with its trials and murmuring, reflects our own seasons of testing, where faith is refined and dependence on God is deepened. The covenant at Sinai reminds us that freedom is not aimless, but shaped by relationship with the one who calls us his own. Moses' intimacy with God, his face radiant with glory, calls us to pursue more than blessings or victories. It calls us to seek the presence of God above all else. His bold request, "Show me your glory," still challenges us today to hunger for the reality of God's character rather than the comforts of the world. Friendship with God is not reserved for the extraordinary, but is extended to all who walk humbly with him, listening, obeying, and yearning for his presence. Even his failures speak with power. When Moses struck the rock in anger, it was a reminder that no leader, however close to God, is immune to weakness. Yet God's love for him endured, showing us that grace holds us even when we falter. The discipline of God does not erase his affection, and our mistakes do not cancel his promises. Moses' death on Mount Nebo shows us the beauty of surrender. He did not step into the land, but he trusted that God's plan was greater than his own desires. His life teaches us that our faithfulness is often about preparing the way for others, building bridges that future generations will cross. Legacy is not measured by what we personally achieve, but by the seeds we plant in obedience to God's calling. The spirit of Moses continues in those who choose to stand in the gap for others, who intercede for mercy, who long to know God deeply, and who live not for themselves, but for the purposes of the one who calls them. His story reminds us that to be a deliverer, a lawgiver, a doubter, and a friend of God is not a contradiction, but the journey of every person who walks with him. When we read of Moses, we are invited to see our own lives through the same lens of divine purpose. We too are drawn out of places of despair, called into seasons of testing, entrusted with words of truth, and invited into friendship with God. The eternal echo of Moses is the call to say yes, even when we feel unworthy, to walk forward even when the way is uncertain, and to trust that God's presence is our greatest treasure. And so, as this story of Moses reaches its conclusion, remember that his journey is not simply about the past, but about how God still works in lives today. His legacy is a call to trust, to obey, to seek, and to surrender. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, like this video, leave a comment with your reflections, and share it with your loved ones, so they too can be inspired by the journey of Moses. Your support helps this message reach more people and keeps this channel growing in its mission to bring hope and encouragement through stories of faith.